The strait was seconds away from silence. Not political silence. Economic silence. The kind that freezes markets, spikes oil, and sends shockwaves across every capital on Earth. Because this time, the threat wasn't theoretical. It was already unfolding. Iran had quietly transformed the narrow waters of Hormuz into a layered trap. Sea mines seeded across shipping lanes. Fast attack boats scattered like moving detonators. Mobile anti-ship missile batteries hidden along the coastline. And above all, drone swarms waiting for the signal. The objective was brutally simple. Make the strait too dangerous to cross. Force the world to negotiate. And prove that one choke point could hold the global economy hostage. For a few tense hours, it worked. Commercial tankers slowed. Insurance premiums surged. Satellite images showed ships drifting outside the danger zone. Oil traders started pricing in chaos. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of pulling back, Washington accelerated. Within hours, surveillance aircraft intensified their patrols. High-altitude drones mapped every suspected minefield. Destroyers shifted formation, not away from the strait, but toward it. This wasn't de-escalation. This was preparation. And what happened next changed everything. U.S. naval planners activated a multi-phase operation designed for one objective: break the trap, reopen Hormuz, and do it fast enough to prevent a global panic. Phase 1 began quietly, almost invisibly. Mine countermeasure vessels moved first. Slow, precise, methodical. Underwater drones descended into the dark water scanning for metallic signatures. Every suspicious object triggered a controlled detonation. Small explosions echoed beneath the waves. Not dramatic, but decisive. However, Iran anticipated this. Fast attack boats began maneuvering aggressively near the clearing zone. Drone activity increased. Coastal radars lit up. The message was clear. Interfere, and the trap becomes lethal. But Washington didn't stop. Instead, Phase 2 unfolded. Carrier-based aircraft launched before sunrise. F-35 stealth fighters flew low, almost hugging the horizon. Electronic warfare aircraft followed, jamming radar frequencies across the coastline. Within minutes, Iranian tracking systems began to flicker. Communications degraded. Targeting data blurred. This wasn't a strike yet. It was blindness. And then, the first real move. Precision munitions targeted suspected missile launchers along the coast. Short bursts. Surgical. No massive bombardment, just key nodes removed. Missile batteries that were meant to control the strait suddenly went quiet. But Iran still had one card left. Drone swarms lifted from multiple launch points. Dozens at first. Then more. Low altitude, fast, difficult to track. For a moment, the risk of escalation surged. Because if those drones reached U.S. ships, the situation could spiral instantly. However, this is where the technology reveal changed the equation. Aegis destroyers activated layered defense systems. Radar locked onto multiple targets simultaneously. Interceptor missiles launched in rapid succession. Close-in weapon systems followed, shredding anything that got too close. Within minutes, the sky above the fleet became a cascade of intercepted drones. The swarm collapsed. And with it, the psychological barrier began to crumble. Phase 3 started immediately. Helicopters carrying special operations teams moved toward key observation points near the strait. Their mission was not occupation, but disruption. Neutralize forward sensors. Identify hidden launchers. Feed real-time intelligence back to command. Meanwhile, additional minesweepers expanded the cleared corridor. One safe lane became two. Two became a navigable path. And then, The moment markets were waiting for. The first escorted tanker moved forward, slowly, cautiously, protected by destroyers on both sides. It wasn't just a ship, it was a signal. Hormuz was reopening, but the tension didn't disappear, because every mile forward carried risk. Every radar blip triggered alarms. Every unidentified boat forced recalculations. This was no longer a standoff. This was a controlled confrontation, minute by minute. And globally, the consequences were immediate. Oil prices stopped climbing. Shipping routes resumed partial operations. Allies began coordinating escort missions. Financial markets stabilized, but only slightly. Because one truth remained. Iran's trap had not fully collapsed. It had been breached. And that difference mattered. Missile batteries deeper inland were still operational. Additional mines could still be deployed. Proxy forces in nearby waters remained unpredictable, which meant the risk of military escalation was still rising. Both sides were now inside the danger zone. Too close, too committed, too visible. And in this environment, even a single miscalculation could ignite something far larger. The question now wasn't whether Hormuz could reopen. It was whether this operation had triggered the next phase of confrontation. Because once forces deploy this close, pulling back becomes harder. Signals get misread. Movements look aggressive. Defensive actions appear offensive. The clock was ticking. The corridor was open. But the crisis was far from over. The corridor was open, but the danger had only shifted. Because reopening the strait did not remove Iran's leverage. It challenged it. And Tehran could not afford to appear passive. Within hours, new signals emerged. Ballistic missile units began relocating deeper inland. Mobile launchers dispersed across hardened positions. Fast attack craft regrouped outside the immediate escort lanes. This wasn't retreat. It was repositioning. And Washington noticed. Satellite imagery detected increased movement near coastal air defense sites. Communications intercepts hinted at contingency planning. Commanders began adjusting force posture in real time. Because once the first tanker passed, the mission changed. It was no longer about breaking the trap. It was about holding the opening. And that is far more dangerous. The U.S. Navy expanded escort operations. Additional destroyers moved into layered formations. Airborne early warning aircraft orbited continuously above the Gulf. Every movement now carried escalation risk. Then, radar operators detected something unusual. Multiple fast-moving surface contacts, approaching at speed. Not directly hostile, but close enough to trigger alarms. Iranian patrol boats. They weren't firing. They weren't retreating. They were probing, testing reaction times, measuring distances, looking for hesitation. For a few tense minutes, both sides held course. This was the closest moment yet. One wrong maneuver, one misinterpreted signal, and the situation could ignite. However, U.S. commanders chose restraint. Helicopters lifted off, hovering visibly above the escort formation. Radio warnings transmitted on emergency channels. Destroyers adjusted position, but did not advance. The boat slowed, then turned away. The confrontation ended. But the message was unmistakable. Iran was not done. And this changed everything. Because now the crisis entered a new phase, indirect pressure. Reports surfaced of additional mine-laying vessels leaving port. Intelligence suggested preparations for nighttime deployments. Drone launch sites became active again, but farther from the coast. The strategy was evolving. Instead of blocking the strait outright, Iran could create intermittent disruptions. Short closures, localized threats, constant uncertainty. This would keep insurance rates high. keep markets unstable, and maintain leverage without triggering full-scale war. Washington understood the implication immediately. To counter intermittent disruption, continuous presence was required. Continuous presence meant prolonged exposure. Prolonged exposure increased escalation probability. The operation was becoming a standoff, stretched over time. Phase 4 quietly began. Additional air assets deployed to the region. Refueling tankers extended patrol duration. Electronic warfare coverage expanded deeper inland. The goal was dominance, not just access. But dominance invites response. And the response came. Long-range drones launched from inland positions, flying wider arcs around the Gulf. Not toward ships, but toward surveillance aircraft. This was a signal. Iran could threaten the eyes in the sky, not just the ships below. For the first time, aerial proximity increased. U.S. fighters intercepted at distance. No shots fired, but the margin for error shrank. The global implications intensified. Energy markets fluctuated hourly. Asian importers began rerouting shipments. European governments issued contingency plans. The strait was open, but fragile. And beneath the surface, another risk emerged. Proxy forces. Unidentified drones appeared near regional shipping lanes outside Hormuz. Commercial vessels reported radar anomalies. Maritime security alerts increased across neighboring waters. The battlefield was expanding. Washington faced a difficult calculation. Escalate and risk regional war. Hold position and accept prolonged tension. Meanwhile, time favored neither side. Each passing day increased operational fatigue. Each close encounter raised miscalculation risk. Each intercepted drone pushed the threshold higher. The crisis was no longer about one trap. It was about momentum. And momentum was building. Because once military forces operate this close, disengagement becomes politically costly. Backing down looks like weakness. Advancing looks like provocation. Both sides were locked in the same dilemma. Then, another development. A second escorted tanker entered the corridor, followed by a third. Traffic was resuming. But with each convoy, exposure multiplied. More ships meant more targets. More targets meant more risk. Commanders began rotating ships, but rotation itself created vulnerability gaps. And analysts started asking a new question. Was reopening Hormuz the beginning of stability, or the start of sustained confrontation? Because the trap had backfired, but it had not disappeared. It had transformed. Iran still retained asymmetric options. The U.S. still needed to protect continuous flow. Neither side could fully disengage. The global economy was breathing again, but shallowly. And the final uncertainty remained. How long could this fragile balance hold before one incident pushes everything over the edge? Night fell over the Gulf, and with darkness, the risk doubled. Because nighttime operations favor ambiguity. Radar reflections become harder to classify. Small vessels blend into background noise. Drone signatures shrink. Both sides knew this. U.S. ships tightened defensive posture. Infrared sensors scanned constantly. Helicopters conducted low-altitude patrols over the corridor. But then, the first alert triggered. Unidentified aerial contacts. Low, slow, multiple. Approaching from different bearings. Drone swarm. Not large enough to overwhelm defenses, but large enough to test them. Interceptors launched immediately. Short bursts of fire lit the sky. Fragments fell into the water. Within minutes, the threat was neutralized. However, the timing mattered. This wasn't a full attack. It was calibration. Iran was measuring reaction speed at night, and Washington understood. If swarms increased in size, the escort mission could become unsustainable. So Phase 5 began. Electronic warfare aircraft expanded jamming coverage. Signal interference disrupted drone navigation bands. Some drones veered off course before reaching the fleet. Technology had shifted the balance again. But this only deepened the strategic contest. Because Iran's doctrine relies on persistence. Not one decisive strike, but constant pressure. Hours later, another signal appeared. Surface radar detected a slow-moving vessel outside the cleared lane. No transponder. Minimal heat signature. Possible mine layer. Helicopters moved to investigate. Spotlights illuminated the hull. The vessel turned and fled. No mines confirmed, but the intent was clear. Iran could reseed the corridor at any time, which meant clearing once was not enough. The operation had to become continuous. This changed the entire risk calculation. Continuous mine clearing requires slower ships. Slower ships require tighter protection. Tighter protection compresses maneuver space, and compressed space increases escalation risk. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels remained silent. Neither side wanted open conflict, but neither side wanted to concede. The standoff hardened. Then, global consequences intensified. Insurance companies classified the strait as a high-risk war zone. Shipping costs surged. Energy traders began factoring long-term instability. Even with passage open, uncertainty dominated. And uncertainty is exactly what Iran needed. Because the objective had shifted from closure to unpredictability, Washington faced a new dilemma. Escalate and neutralize launch sites inland, or maintain defensive posture and accept ongoing tension. Both options carried danger. Airstrikes inland risked widening the war. Holding position risked attrition. Commanders opted for controlled dominance. Fighter patrols increased frequency. Surveillance expanded beyond coastal zones. Destroyers adjusted formations to cover wider arcs. This wasn't escalation, but it was pressure. And pressure invites response. Shortly before dawn, another close encounter. Two fast boats accelerated toward the escort group. Not directly hostile, but inside warning distance. Helicopters descended low. Warning shots fired ahead of their path. For a moment, everything froze. The boats slowed, turned, withdrew. Again, no shots exchanged. But the pattern was undeniable. The crisis was being stretched, minute by minute. Each probe, each interception, each convoy pushed both sides closer to the edge. And globally, leaders were watching closely. Think. Because if one drone slipped through, if one missile launched, if one ship took damage, the fragile balance would collapse instantly. The strait remained open, but it was no longer stable. It was a corridor under constant tension. And the final question now loomed larger than ever. Was this controlled confrontation sustainable? Or was the world witnessing the slow build-up to something far bigger? Dawn broke, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it intensified. Because daylight brought visibility, and visibility brought exposure. Convoys increased in size. More tankers, more escorts, more aircraft overhead. The operation was scaling up. And scaling up meant the stakes were rising. U.S. commanders expanded the protective perimeter. Destroyers repositioned farther out. Air patrols extended deeper into the Gulf. This wasn't just defense anymore. It was controlled dominance. But then, a new alert. Long-range radar picked up a high-speed launch inland. Not toward ships, but climbing fast. Ballistic trajectory. For a few seconds, uncertainty spread across command networks. Target, unknown. Intent, unclear. Missile defense systems activated automatically. Tracking algorithms calculated potential impact zones. However, the missiles splashed down far from the convoy. A demonstration. A signal. Iran was reminding everyone, escalation options still existed. This changed the psychological balance. Because even without direct engagement, ballistic capability added pressure. Every escort mission now carried a new variable. Not just drones. Not just mines. But long-range missiles. Washington responded carefully. Missile defense destroyers moved closer to the corridor. Airborne early warning coverage intensified. Commanders integrated layered interception planning. The operation had evolved again. But the most dangerous moment came hours later. A civilian tanker, slightly outside the main convoy, reported radar lock warnings. Unknown source. Brief, but real. Escorts shifted immediately. Fighters diverted to the area. Electronic warfare aircraft began sweeping frequencies. No launch followed. But the incident proved something critical. Even partial disruption could shake confidence. Confidence was the real battlefield now. Markets reacted instantly. Oil ticked upward. Shipping alerts multiplied. Iran didn't need to close the strait. Just destabilize trust. And that strategy was working. Washington accelerated Phase 6. Continuous aerial coverage, day and night. Expanded drone surveillance over suspected launch corridors. Additional logistics ships deployed to sustain prolonged presence. This wasn't a short operation anymore. It was turning into endurance. But endurance favors unpredictability. Because fatigue increases risk, complexity increases mistakes. And mistakes trigger escalation. Late afternoon, another probe. Multiple drones launched simultaneously from dispersed points. Higher altitude this time. Different flight pattern. Interceptors engaged again. Some drones jammed, others destroyed. But one slipped through outer layers, only to be neutralized by close-range defense. Still, the margin was shrinking. Commanders understood the pattern. Each wave slightly different. Each probe slightly more complex. Iran was adapting. And adaptation meant the confrontation was entering a new stage. The U.S. had broken the trap, but now it had to outlast the pressure. Globally, attention intensified. Energy ministers held emergency meetings. Naval allies considered joining escort missions. Insurance markets fluctuated hourly. The strait remained open, but fragile. And then, the most telling development. Iranian communications chatter increased across multiple sectors, not coordinated for immediate attack, but consistent with readiness posture. Both sides were now fully committed, without declaring war. The corridor functioned. Ships passed. Oil flowed. But every minute, forces remained face-to-face. Weapons active. Sensors locked. Decisions compressed into seconds. This was no longer just a crisis. It was a sustained military pressure point. And the world was watching the same question grow louder. How long can two heavily armed forces operate this close? Before one incident turns tension into conflict, by the third day, the pattern became undeniable. The strait was open, but the crisis was deepening. Because constant pressure was taking its toll. Crew rotations shortened. Pilots logged extended combat patrols. Mine-clearing teams operated almost non-stop. Fatigue was creeping in. And fatigue breeds mistakes. Washington attempted to stabilize the tempo. Escort schedules were standardized. Convoys organized into tighter windows. Air cover layered more predictably. But predictability creates opportunity. and Iran adjusted again. Instead of probing convoys directly, activity shifted to the edges. Unidentified drones appeared near support vessels. Electronic interference targeted surveillance aircraft. Fast boats shadowed refueling tankers. The strategy was subtle. Pressure the support network, not the front line. This forced commanders to stretch resources wider. More patrols. More escorts. More risk. Then, the closest call yet. A minesweeper reported sonar contact directly inside the cleared lane. Not debris. Not marine life. A solid object. Operations paused instantly. Convoy slowed. Divers prepared for inspection. Minutes felt like hours. Underwater drone deployed. Visual confirmation followed. A newly placed sea mine. The implication was explosive. Despite constant patrols, the corridor could be reseeded. Anytime. Anywhere. Controlled detonation followed. A muted underwater blast, but strategically massive. Because now uncertainty returned to maximum. Convoys resumed, but slower. Aircraft tightened coverage. Destroyers shifted closer. This was no longer just tension. It was attrition. Iran didn't need to block the strait. Just keep it dangerous. And Washington realized the long-term challenge. Maintaining permanent dominance requires sustained logistics. Sustained logistics require regional stability. Regional stability was eroding. Meanwhile, global consequences intensified. Oil traders began hedging long-term disruptions. Shipping companies explored alternate routes. Governments released emergency reserves. The world was adapting, but nervously. And then, the escalation risk spiked again. Late evening, radar picked up multiple simultaneous launches inland. Not ballistic this time. Cruise missile profiles. Tracking systems activated immediately. Interceptors prepared. Air patrols vectored to potential engagement zones. For a moment, the entire operation held its breath. But the missiles altered course, splashing far from the corridor. Another demonstration. Iran was escalating signaling without crossing the line. Washington answered with presence. Additional fighter squadrons rotated into theater. Missile defense ships repositioned for overlapping coverage. Command networks shifted to higher alert status. Both sides were tightening the spring. Because every signal, every probe, every response reduced maneuver space. And when maneuver space disappears, escalation becomes accidental. The convoy system held. Ships kept moving. But the environment was becoming increasingly volatile. Analysts began calling it a sustained brink. Not war, not peace, but constant readiness for both. And the most dangerous factor remained unchanged. Proximity. U.S. ships, Iranian patrols, drones, aircraft, all operating within minutes of reaction time. One misread radar return. One defensive launch interpreted as offensive. One mechanical failure mistaken for attack. Any of these could ignite the entire region. Yet neither side disengaged. Because disengagement meant surrendering leverage. And leverage was the core of this confrontation. The strait stayed open. But stability remained out of reach. And the question now dominated strategic circles worldwide. Was this prolonged standoff the new normal? Or the countdown to the moment everything finally breaks? By the end of the week, the strait looked calm. Ships moved. Escorts held formation. Aircraft traced familiar patterns overhead. But the calm was deceptive. Because beneath the surface, both sides were preparing for the next phase. Iran began shifting assets deeper inland. Mobile missile launchers disappeared from previously known sites. Drone operators rotated to new locations. Fast boats reduced visible activity. At first glance, It looked like de-escalation. But intelligence analysts saw something different. Dispersal. Instead of concentrating near the strait, Iran was expanding the threat zone. Multiple smaller launch points. Wider operational arcs. Less predictable patterns. This forced Washington to widen coverage. More surveillance. More patrols. More strain. And strain increases vulnerability. Then, a sudden development. A commercial tanker reported GPS interference. Navigation systems fluctuated. Course deviation alarms triggered. Not a direct attack, but a powerful signal. Electronic warfare. Iran could disrupt navigation without firing a shot. Convoys tightened spacing immediately. Backup navigation protocols activated. But uncertainty spread again. Because now, even safe passage could become disoriented. Washington responded with countermeasures. Signal stabilization equipment deployed. Electronic warfare aircraft intensified monitoring. The technological duel had entered a new domain. Hours later, another probe. A reconnaissance drone flew unusually close to escorting destroyers. Not armed, but deliberately visible. Fighters intercepted. The drone turned away. This wasn't aggression. It was messaging. Iran was demonstrating persistence. Meanwhile, operational fatigue continued to build. Maintenance cycles shortened. Crew rest windows narrowed. Aircraft sortie rates climbed. The operation was holding, but at cost. And cost accumulates. Then, the incident that raised alarms across command centers. 2 convoys overlapped near the corridor entrance. Traffic density increased. Radar returns multiplied. At the same moment, fast boats appeared at distance. Not approaching, but tracking. For several tense minutes, the situation became chaotic. Multiple ships maneuvering. Helicopters airborne. Communications saturated. No shots fired, but the near congestion exposed a vulnerability. The more traffic resumed, the harder control became. Iran didn't need to attack. Complexity alone created risk. Washington adjusted immediately. Convoy spacing expanded. Entry windows staggered. Additional coordination protocols activated. Still, the lesson remained. The strait was open, but fragile under pressure. Globally, leaders began preparing for prolonged instability. Strategic reserves considered. Alternate pipelines discussed. Naval cooperation expanded quietly. This was no longer a short crisis. It was becoming structural. And yet, neither side escalated openly. Because both understood the consequences. A direct strike. A damaged tanker. A lost aircraft. Any of these could trigger chain reactions across the region. So the confrontation stayed in the gray zone. Pressure without war. Signals without strikes. Dominance without declaration. But gray zones don't last forever. Because over time, tension seeks release. The final factor now loomed. Duration. The longer forces remain deployed, the greater the chance of accident, the greater the chance of misinterpretation, the greater the chance of escalation. The Strait of Hormuz was flowing again. Oil moved. Markets stabilized slightly. Yet the underlying standoff remained unresolved. 2 strategies, still colliding. One aiming to maintain pressure, the other determined to ensure passage. Neither backing down. And with every passing hour, the same question echoed louder across capitals worldwide. Was this fragile balance holding the region together? Or delaying the moment when a single spark ignites something far bigger? By the 10th day, the operation had settled into rhythm. Convoys moved at fixed intervals. Aircraft rotated in predictable cycles. Destroyers maintained overlapping radar coverage. On the surface, it looked controlled, structured, manageable. But underneath, pressure was still building. Because the longer this continued, the harder disengagement became. U.S. commanders now faced a strategic dilemma: maintain presence indefinitely or gradually scale back. Both carried risk. Scaling back could invite renewed disruption. Staying meant prolonged exposure. And Tehran understood this perfectly. Iran shifted tactics again. Instead of frequent probes, activity became sporadic. Long, quiet periods, followed by sudden signals. Unpredictability replaced constant pressure. The goal was psychological. Keep commanders guessing. Force continuous alertness. Drain endurance. Then, a sudden escalation scare. Early morning, a radar track appeared high altitude. Fast-moving. Descending. Air defense systems locked instantly. Fighters vectored for intercept. For several seconds, tension peaked. But the object turned out to be a reconnaissance platform, altering course. No engagement. Still, the incident demonstrated something crucial. Reaction time had shrunk to seconds. Any ambiguity now risked immediate defensive action. And defensive action could be misinterpreted. Meanwhile, shipping volume increased further. Confidence slowly returning. More tankers entering the corridor. But more ships meant more complexity. More coordination. More chance for confusion. Late afternoon, another close call. A civilian cargo vessel deviated slightly from a signed path. Navigation error. But escort radar interpreted it as potential obstruction. Warning calls transmitted. Helicopters launched. Destroyers adjusted formation. The ship corrected course. No incident. But the margin for error was razor-thin. Globally, analysts began calling it stability under tension. Flow restored, but risk constant. Washington began subtle repositioning. Some aircraft rotated out, replaced by fresh crews. Logistics ships reinforced sustainment lines. Commanders prepared for long-term posture. This wasn't ending. It was transitioning. Iran mirrored the shift. Reduced visible presence, but maintained capability. Missile units remained dispersed. Drone infrastructure intact. Mine-laying potential preserved. Both sides had settled into strategic endurance. The trap had backfired, but not disappeared. The strait was open, but contested, and the world adjusted to this new reality. Oil stabilized, but volatility remained. Shipping resumed, but insurance stayed high. Military presence normalized, but tension persisted. This was no longer a crisis measured in hours. It had become a prolonged standoff, and that created the final strategic question. If both sides can maintain this balance, will deterrence hold? Or will the accumulated friction eventually trigger the one incident neither side truly wants? Because history shows, long standoffs rarely end quietly. Sometimes, they simply wait for the moment when caution slips and everything changes. So now the world watches closely. Will this fragile corridor remain open under constant pressure? Or is the Strait of Hormuz heading toward the next turning point that could reshape global stability? Night returned to the Gulf, and with it, the stakes rose once again. Darkness favors concealment. It favors uncertainty. It favors mistakes. New signals emerged. Drone activity increased at low altitude. Fast boats operated closer to convoy edges. Electronic interference spiked intermittently. Washington responded immediately. Additional reconnaissance aircraft launched. Helicopters hovered over escort formations. Destroyers adjusted positioning to cover vulnerable sectors. Every move was measured. Every response calculated. But in this environment, calculation can never eliminate risk. Then, a sudden alert. A fast-moving radar contact approached one of the tankers. Initial assessment. Hostile intent. Tensions spiked across the fleet. Helicopters intercepted. Warning signals transmitted. Flares launched. The vessel altered course. Crisis averted. This time. But the incident confirmed a harsh reality. Nothing in this corridor could ever be routine again. Iran's asymmetric pressure was relentless. Not outright attack. Not full-scale engagement. Just constant, evolving threat. Washington adjusted. More aerial patrols. Additional surveillance drones deployed. Electronic warfare aircraft increased coverage over suspected threat vectors. This was no longer merely about reopening the strait. It was about sustaining access, day and night, against a cunning, adaptive opponent. The global impact escalated. Markets fluctuated on every report. Energy imports shifted routes. Governments prepared contingency plans. Even with passage technically restored, uncertainty dominated. The strait was open, but fragile, precarious. By the third week, operational fatigue became apparent. Extended rotations, high-tempo sorties, continuous mine-clearing operations. Mistakes could happen at any moment, and mistakes at this scale risked sparking regional war. Commanders now faced a critical decision: maintain constant dominance, or reduce presence and risk renewed disruption. Tehran's strategy had evolved, not to stop the flow of oil, but to make maintaining it perilous. Every convoy, every helicopter, every destroyer operated under constant observation, every move scrutinized, every misstep amplified. The psychological toll was real. Even without direct combat, both sides were engaged in a high-stakes chess match. And yet, global attention continued to tighten. Energy, security, geopolitical stability, military signaling. The Strait of Hormuz had become more than a passage. It had become the epicenter of global tension, a corridor where minutes could define the balance of power. The trap may have been bypassed, but the conflict was far from over, and the world was left asking the same question. How long can this delicate equilibrium hold? Before one miscalculation, one unplanned encounter, triggers a chain reaction with consequences no one can control?